Hey everyone, so for today's lecture we're going to be looking at the end of the Cold War. This is how the Cold War ended in the 1980s with the collapse of the Soviet Union and how the United States was ultimately victorious in this conflict. So the Cold War ended when the Soviet Union collapsed. So the communist dictatorship that had been established after the Russian Revolution ultimately fell apart when the USSR and Eastern Europe disintegrated in the late 1980s. What happened is that the governments that had been funded in Eastern Europe, these communist-backed dictatorships, folded and communism disappeared in the region. So the two main reasons for the collapse were that there were problems with the Soviet Union. Structures within the Soviet Union caused the government to fall apart. But there were also U.S. actions. Remember, this is the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union are at conflict. So the United States did several things to kind of exacerbate or lead to problems within the Soviet Union. So the fracture begins within the Soviet Union. Internal problems caused the USSR to begin to fracture in the 1980s. Remember, this is a communist dictatorship. There is no capitalist society. Remember how they had to wait in line to get their bread, wait in line for everything. And the economy begins to fall apart because of this. The government owns everything. And so people are relying on the government, and this begins to fracture in the 1980s. So while the economy was struggling under a communist regime, the state was spending a lot of money on the military. And this military spending was too much spending. Military expenses stretched the Soviet economy. So while they're not bringing a lot of money from taxes, not bringing a lot of money from their economy, they are spending a lot on the military. So even though the USSR had 1/2 as much money as the United States, it spent just as much on defense. So the Soviet economy was about half of what the United States economy was, but it was spending the same amount as the US annually on their defense budget. The Soviet Union was also stretched by the war in Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet forces entered Afghanistan to back a communist dictator, and this ended up almost being like the Soviet Vietnam. The U.S. funded enemies of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union basically could not win this war in Afghanistan. The Soviet military budget was also stretched thin because of the idea of mutually assured destruction, known as the acronym MAD. What this was is a military strategy that was adopted by both the United States and the Soviet Union that targeted cities and population centers with nuclear weapons. So the idea is that in the event of a nuclear war, the United States would launch nuclear weapons at Soviet cities. The Soviet Union would launch them at United States cities. The idea is that both countries would be destroyed in the event of a nuclear war. And that's where we get the acronym MAD from. It's insane. But this led to massive nuclear arsenals. This built to an arms race continued. So the USSR had 39,000 nuclear warheads in 1985, while the United States had 21,000. So the USSR has more weapons at this point, but they've also spent way too much. Remember, they have less money. Their economy is not as productive as the United States. They're spending way more money on their nuclear arsenal, and this is going to bankrupt the country. The United States also encouraged this collapse. The United States in the 1980s realized that it could push the Soviet Union to the breaking point. So Ronald Reagan intentionally increased military spending in order to bankrupt the USSR. So when Reagan comes to power in 1980, comes to presidency, he increases the budget, brings in new weapons, build up a more modern military arsenal. And what the Soviet Union does in response to this is they continue to spend money they do not have on their military. One of the big things that Reagan pushed for was the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as Star Wars. This was a nuclear shield of satellites. It was actually never built, but the idea of it forced the Soviets to spend more and more money. The idea that their nuclear weapons wouldn't be able to reach the United States in the event of a conflict. So the United States is encouraging the Soviet Union to spend more money through their own military expenditures. As all of this is happening, the economy is struggling. The state is spending money on the military that they do not have. This is leading to growing division inside the republics of the Soviet Union. So the USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Soviet Union was made up of 15 republics. Remember, after World War II, the Iron Curtain closed in Eastern Europe, and these became basically satellite states of Russia, of the Soviet Union, but they were former countries. And so what happens is nationalism grew in many of these republics, causing the people to want to break off from the USSR. So places like Poland, places like Czechoslovakia began to have nationalist movements being like, we don't want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore. And so there's growing division inside the USSR. So Ronald Reagan in the United States foreign policy only made these fractures worse. Reagan challenged the communist government's control over the republics. So basically called out the Soviet Union, saying that these republics, such as places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, should be allowed to have their independence. And this is where you get Reagan's famous phrase of Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. What he's saying is to Mikhail Gorbachev, who's the premier of the Soviet Union, is saying that tear down the Berlin Wall, allow these republics to become independent, allow them to be free nations again. So Mikhail Gorbachev, who is a Soviet premier in the 1980s, realizes that the Soviet Union has to reform in order to remain in existence, that these are massive problems within the country. And so Gorbachev pushes for reform. He tried to change the Soviet Union. He initiated what was known as glasnost, which is an openness. So where the Soviet Union had been very closed, now they try to open up more, open up to the outside world, have more trade, and open up within the Soviet Union, have more open trade, more open society than had been. He initiated what was known as perestroika, which are economic reforms, which are bringing in some market aspects to the Soviet economy to try to fix the Soviet economy. And he also initiated what are known as the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, or START. These are negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union to try to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons each side had. Remember, they'd built up massive arsenals. So Gorbachev is trying to create a more open society. He's trying to reform the economy, and he's trying to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. So he's really trying to fix problems within the Soviet Union. But this whole idea of reform actually backfires on the Soviet Union, on the leadership of the Communist Party. Communism falls apart. They push for reform, show that there were problems within communism. So the idea is that we have to change our economic structure, we have to open up, and showing that actually there's a problem within the state itself. This causes the Eastern European nations and the Soviet people to call for the end of the system of government. So the idea is here, like, well, if you're saying we have to change all these things, obviously there's a problem with the system. We should just get rid of this system. So the USSR and the Eastern Bloc collapsed starting in 1989. This is a course where you see these famous pictures of the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. This began in 1989 as East Germany's government fell apart and Germany is unified. So this really creates a new world. The Soviet Union has failed. The great communist experiment, the great communist dictatorship in Eastern Europe and Russia has failed. So you have the fall of the Berlin Wall, you have the unification of Germany, you have the end of the Cold War. This really opens up a new era in world history. The United States will be the sole superpower in the world. There's not going to be a conflict between the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union does not exist anymore. So this is really a new world as we move into the 1990s.